This is your second audio PowerPoint for Roads to the Revolution. The war has to begin, and it's important to remember from the previous PowerPoint that at this time, the British government was exerting immense pressure on the colonists, and there was a change in philosophy at the time. General Thomas Gage is appointed as Royal Governor of Massachusetts, and his first kind of action is to order the arrest of John Hancock and Samuel Adams. John Hancock would have been important in the Boston Tea Party, and Samuel Adams was a son of liberty. But in addition to this, Hancock and Adams and other leaders established essentially a sub-government without Gage. They tried to run the Massachusetts colony separate from him, and in doing so, they also began a stockpile of weapons and ammunition. Gage orders their arrest, and he also orders the seizure of their stockpile in Concord. The Battle of Lexington is where the war begins. You may have heard of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, which is a poem that talks about one if by land and two if by sea. Essentially a signaling system that they would have used to alert the local militias that the British were coming. Paul Revere and others alerted the militia. It was not just Paul Revere alone. 70 militia gather, and again, these are part-time soldiers, so these are also farmers and merchants and people who are not formally trained in military tactics, and they stand against the British redcoats. The first shot is fired here at Lexington, and the Patriots end up with 8 dead. This is where the war officially begins. So Lexington, Massachusetts is a very important part of this that you guys should remember. The Battle of Concord is also happening, and this is where we're introduced to the Minutemen. So called because they were a Patriot militia that would mobilize within minutes. After the British emptied the arsenal at Concord, they marched back towards Boston, which is a British stronghold. Remember, they have the port of Boston. This is where the Quartering Act happened, so there are going to be several British soldiers in Boston. The Redcoats are met along the way between 3,000 to 4,000 Minutemen. They kill and wound over 200 British soldiers, and the British retreat to Boston. The Patriots gain control of the New England colonies, and those who are loyal to the crown actually flee to seek refuge in Boston. And we talk about the loyalists, these are going to be colonists that still believe that the British were correct. So these are colonists fleeing to Boston to seek refuge with the British government. 3 main camps of colonists that you should know at this time. The first are the Patriots, and they're the ones that are really pushing for the revolution. Believed in complete independence from England, they're inspired by Locke and Paine, by Patrick Henry's Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death. They're going to provide the troops for the American army, and they're going to be led by George Washington of Virginia. The Loyalists are going to be colonists who still see themselves as British subjects. They remain loyal to Britain both culturally and economically, and they felt that the British were just in asking for taxation and making the American settlers pay for protection against Indian attacks. The neutrals are going to be many colonists that really don't fall into either of these categories, but just truly want to stay uninvolved. In 1775, the rest of the colonies start to respond, and we have the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Congress is going to assume responsibility for the war. They're going to authorize the printing of paper money, which will later become problematic because individual states will print their own money, and it's going to have no federal backing to it. So in other words, there's no universal currency. And they're going to lack the authority to collect taxes, which again, when it comes to trying to fight a war and raise funds for the materials needed for the war, the Congress doesn't have the right to do that. The Middle and Southern militias are going to march to join the Patriots in their siege on Boston, and George Washington is tactically made commander of the Continental Army. 1, he made a name for himself during the French and Indian War, but 2, they needed to get Virginia involved, and Virginia being the largest and the most powerful of the colonies, it was necessary for them to have representation, and bringing George Washington as the commander of the Continental Army was a great way to pull Virginia into the war. The British have several advantages. 1, they have greater manufacturing, which if you're going to fight a war that's going to last a couple of years and it's going to be in the New England area, especially over winter, it's great not just to have ammunition and weapons, but to have coats and shoes and other supplies that are necessary to fight a battle. They also have a larger population, which means they have more soldiers. So their soldiers are actually trained and they're more well supplied. So they don't really think that this war is a serious threat, and they really don't think the colonial militias are a serious threat. We move into the deadliest battle of the war, which happens quite early on, and that is the Battle of Bunker Hill. It really happens on Breed's Hill, north of Boston, in 1775. Lord William Howe, a British, is going to order a frontal assault on the Patriots, and you're going to hold your fire until you can see the whites of their eyes. The Patriots are going to have a very different tactic when it comes to engaging the British forces. They are not going to fight a conventional war. They hold off 2 assaults of the Redcoats, and it's going to be in the 3rd assault that the British will win, not because the Patriots are losing ground, but they run out of ammunition. The Redcoats will suffer about 1,100 losses. The militia will suffer 300. Now, 300 doesn't seem like a very large number in comparison, but remember, there are far fewer militiamen than there are going to be British Redcoats. During this time, there is an olive branch or a peace petition sent to the King of England, and it's requesting a return to the former harmony that they had previously had. But there's a condition in this. The colonies don't want to swear their allegiance to the Parliament, just to the king. In other words, they're still fighting for their own representation. The king rejects this proclamation and says that the colonies are in a full state of rebellion, and so the final thread, that final tie to England, has been severed. At this time, we'll have another influential voice that will impact the philosophy of the colonies. Thomas Paine is going to write Common Sense. He's an English immigrant to America, and he is going to direct his attack not at the Parliament, but against the king in a pamphlet called Common Sense. This is very important because it will be influential in Thomas Jefferson's writing of the Declaration of Independence. Common Sense doesn't challenge Parliament, which is what most of the colonists were fighting against, representation. It starts to challenge the idea of having a king. It was read by American colonists, and it contributed to the growing desire for more independence, not just from the Parliament, but from the king entirely, so the idea of England. Common people everywhere could reject a king, and they could also then see themselves as being represented in a republic. The Declaration of Independence is going to happen in 1776. So the spring of 1776, we have the Continental Congress, and they are going to elect to create a committee that should draft this document. Heading it is Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. He will actually write or pen the Declaration of Independence. He's heavily influenced by Paine, but you're also going to see that he's heavily influenced by John Locke. On July 4th, 1776, we will have the Declaration of Independence being signed. Declaration of Independence, this is where you're going to see the influence of John Locke. When Thomas Jefferson writes this, he writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." He continues on, "We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, not property as Locke had originally wrote, but the pursuit of happiness. And again, not everyone was ready for all people to have property rights. Then you see the kind of expression of Locke's social contract, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among the people, and that our governments get their power from us, the people. And finally, that if the government were to become destructive, the people have the right to alter or abolish it to institute a new government. Essentially, this is Locke's entire argument for a social contract, and the breaking of a social contract means the right to rebel. Jefferson also goes on to detail many of the grievances that Thomas Paine had written about in Common Sense. First, the colonists had no say in determining laws that governed them, whether through the king, but even more so through the Parliament. And more so that the king disregarded this and had little or no concern for them. That it refused them to have legislatures or to elect people to present themselves or represent them. That the king had attempted to prevent foreigners from coming to the colonies. The king alone decided the tenure of judges. This will become heavily important when you look at the establishment of our Supreme Court. Supreme Court judges have lifelong tenure. If your job depended on whether or not you made the king happy, many of these judges would then have to rule in ways that favored the king. The king forced the Quartering Act on the colonists, making them house soldiers. He had taken away rights from colonists in Canada, and many of the colonists further south began to fear that that would happen to them as well. We'll talk about the mercenaries that he hired, the Hessians, and the colonists asked that the king address these issues, and he outright ignored them. And the final kind of pushback being his right to accept the Olive Branch petition. So we're going to look at how Thomas Paine and John Locke influenced Jefferson. So key principles in the Declaration of Independence will increase political, social, and economic participation. The idea of equality, extending the franchise, upholding due process of law, giving people the right to time in court, providing free public education to anybody, liberty, abolishing slavery, extending civil rights to women and other groups. Now, we all understand that this idea of liberty does not necessarily go to plan. And economic participation, which the pursuit of happiness, allowing for a free enterprise system, promoting economic opportunity, and protecting property rights. In other words, nothing that's just controlled by the government, that people can make their own way. The British are fighting a different kind of war than the colonists. They're used to a very tactical war that meant if you captured port cities and captured the capital, then you win. They do this, but they're still not winning. And they also hire Hessians, which are brutal German mercenaries, and this angers the colonists. The Patriots, however, are fighting for public opinion and public support. So they engage only when their casualties will be minimal and that they think they can win. And when they are in battle, their local militias are actually trying to root out and get rid of anyone that is loyal to the British Crown within the colonies. Thomas Paine will continue to write. He writes The American Crisis. George Washington reads this to his troops, and it further encourages them about what they're doing and why it is correct. On the civilian front, women, just like during the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and so on, when the able-bodied men are out fighting, they're going to leave their responsibilities to the women and to sometimes the elderly. So able-bodied women were running farms and shops, making clothes, providing any of the manufactured goods or textiles that they could supplement from their own efforts. There's a blockade at the ports that is preventing British goods or manufactured goods in. So profiteers, or what we would call pirates, they are bringing in illegal goods and making money from that. And then the paper money is going to lead to inflation. The money is only going to have value if the Patriots win. The war is going to begin to shift to the middle states. We have the Battle of Trenton. During this battle, the British are going to win some of their battles in Boston, and they're going to move south to New York City. General Howe is going to capture New York City September 15th and force Washington to retreat to Trenton, New Jersey, across the Delaware River. Washington needs a victory, so on Christmas night, he and his troops cross an icy Delaware River and capture 918 German mercenaries. This success is going to spur them forward. Please understand that Washington troops, they were underfed, underclothed, that this was as much a victory as it was just truly a moral victory. Many of us have seen this picture of Washington crossing the Delaware. And the big thing that you should kind of take from it is not just Washington standing at the helm, but the poor clothing that is provided to the soldiers, the ice that's in the river. This was truly a kind of desperate moment for the American or the colonial militias. We move on to the fight for Philadelphia. Washington is going to inflict heavy casualties on General Cornwallis's troops at the Battle of Princeton. In fall of 1777, General Howe invades Philadelphia. The Continental Congress will flee, and we move on to the battles of Brandywine and Germantown, where Howe wins. Now, I know we're going through this rather quickly, but these are going to be more footnotes unless you really want to get into Revolutionary War history, and that's when you would take a course more on battles and wars. The battle for Saratoga is the turning point. So Lexington starts the war. Saratoga is where the war shifts. So the original plan was to travel from Canada to meet Howe in New York, and the British generals would have met up. During their travels, the British meet with Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, and their travel through the wilderness is met with heavy resistance, and in this, the Americans win. And so there's a surrendering on October 17th of 1777. Saratoga is going to be a turning point psychologically and also militarily for the colonies. But here's another kind of part that we haven't talked about yet. With the American victory, the French actually believe that they should support the American Revolution. Before this, it looked like a lost cause or something that wasn't going to show any promise, and so the French were withholding any kind of support. The French start to become part of the revolution. So they provide military expertise. The Marquis de Lafayette will start to formally train soldiers, and they also provide supplies. The Treaty Alliance is negotiated by Ben Franklin. So Benjamin Franklin is going to become important not only in the Olive Branch Petition, but now again, here he is in the Treaty Alliance with France. Spain will enter the war as a French ally. Now they still have interest in the colonies, and so they're not necessarily here because they want to align themselves with the American colonies. The French and the Spanish really aren't threatened by the colonies, but they are fearful of what it would mean if the British were to win. So they are not truly American allies. They don't want to inspire their own colonies to revolt. The Spanish governor of Louisiana is going to provide supplies to patriots that will prevent the British from entering the Mississippi through the New Orleans area. Here we have the winter at Valley Forge, and this is going to be one of the harshest winters that the colonial army is going to have to make it through. They're going to lack supplies. They're going to have 10,000 soldiers. A third of them are going to have no shoes or coats, so the lack of supplies is going to become even more detrimental. And we have, again, more outside help with drilling troops and helping them become actually an organized force. So there's a change of focus. The improved force, June of '78, the British leave Philadelphia. They fight off Washington's troops at Monmouth, but the Patriots now demonstrate that they are truly becoming an army, that they're not just these disjointed militias. We also have the introduction of Native Americans for the first time in this discussion. Now, the colonists continue to disregard the proclamation of 1763, and they continue to encroach in the Ohio River Valley, crossing the Appalachian Mountains. The Native Americans are going to attack the colonists with support from the British. Again, when we're looking at this, the Native Americans don't care who's supporting them. They just really don't want anyone encroaching on their homes. So, Colonial George Rogers Clark will turn the Native Americans against the British, and they're going to recapture a British fort, and by the end of the war, the colonists have actually laid claim to the Ohio River Valley. Now we have the British in the South. They're going to win early victories, and they continue conventional war, but they don't rally and organize the support of the Loyalists. As the British gain victories in the South, the Spanish attacked the British forts on the Gulf Coast, and the intent for Spain was to solidify power and to help divert the British troops. And again, they're not so concerned about the colonists, they just want to keep the British from their own territory. We're going to continue to move through this rather quickly. So the Revolution and part of the Civil War, the Kings Mountain, Patriots crushed the Loyalist militia in South Carolina. So this is where it's more civil. You have colonial army against colonial. So the Patriots are actually going to fight against a Loyalist militia. These are going to be colonists that are still sympathetic to the British. They execute the prisoners. The neutral civilians who weren't Tories or Loyalists and they weren't Patriots now kind of feel compelled to move towards the Patriot cause, so they're not confused with Loyalists. General Cornwallis will march north towards Virginia, but essentially he's going to march into a trap that will be the end of the Civil War. At Yorktown, summer of 1781, the French fleet will block the Chesapeake Bay, trapping the British Navy in the Chesapeake. Washington will march south to trap the British by land, and essentially you have trapped at land, trapped at sea. The British are stuck between the French and the American militia, and they surrender. So Cornwallis will surrender at Yorktown, and the French are going to start to make a difference in the numbers, helping this kind of securing of an American victory. The Treaty of Paris is what will officially end the Revolutionary War. Part of what feeds this is that the British public is fed up with having to supply a war that they're really having a hard time understanding why. This is going to come from their taxes, they're funding this, and they're not seeing any reason to continue on. An American delegation, to include Benjamin Franklin, is going to represent the colonies at the Treaty of Paris. It recognizes America's independence. It grants us secured boundaries. In other words, it outlines what will be the American colonies, and we actually secure more territory than what was won in the battles. Americans will strain their alliance with France because French thought that they were going to control the negotiations, that they were going to speak on part of the American colonies. And of course, the colonies don't want this. They want to speak for themselves. The entire purpose of this revolution was to have self-representation. The impact of this: the British will abandon the Native Americans, so now they are completely vulnerable to westward expansion, which will hit them most notably in the early 1800s as we have to push westward. The Loyalists are going to flee to Canada, so anyone who is still sympathetic to the Crown will move to areas still controlled by the British in Canada. Women actually don't gain any of the political rights that were really outlined for them. Abigail Adams asks her husband to remember the ladies. In other words, remember that we supported this war, and it is acknowledged, but not in a legal sense. New Jersey is the only state that allows widows to vote. Women still cannot own property, they cannot vote, they cannot make contracts, which severely limits their rights to self-determination. In the northern colonies, slaves are emancipated. Some individuals in the South actually free their slaves, especially if those slaves served in the war. But the South retains slavery, and again, we understand that this is going to be one of the things that leads to the American Civil War. And ultimately, this ends up inspiring the French Revolution. This should hopefully bring together the American Revolution for you. You do have guided notes and additional activities. Please make sure that if you have any questions that you ask your substitute teacher. If they are unable to answer them, please ask myself, Mrs. Murphy, or Mr. Kuzma, or Ms. Cooper, and we would be more than happy to help you out with anything that you may not understand.